Evangelion, says Hideaki Anno, is like a jigsaw puzzle where the customer is presented with pieces of the puzzle. The assembling of the pieces is left to the audience. But there are no pictures of the finished product, so everyone imagines a different picture of the finished one. If there are parts that you can't find, I just tell you to fill in the missing parts by yourself. The process of assembling a jigsaw is fun, but the process of imagining the finished one is more fun. In 1996, the TV series Neon Genesis Evangelion culminated in a cryptic manner as a result of Studio Gainax's budget and scheduling disaster. Viewers are thus presented with a highly abstract ending within episodes 25 to 26. The abrupt shift to the aftermath of Human Instrumentality raised questions to what exactly happened prior to those two episodes. A year later, The End of Evangelion was released to consolidate the anime's ending. The film, however, only adds further to the confusion. Therein, viewers are not only mesmerized throughout, but also provoked. From the infamous opening scene to the liquidation of everyone into orange Fanta, and to the ending scene where Shinji chokes Asuka. The word provocative best describes Evangelion. Provocative, not in the bad, but good sense. Its Latin derivation, provocare, for instance, means to call forth, or challenge. Indeed, Evangelion calls forth and challenges its viewers to think. Is Evangelion just an expression of Hideaki's own depression, or perhaps the opposite? Perhaps it tells us a way out of depression. Is Evangelion's deployment of psychoanalysis, theological and philosophical concepts pretentious and irrelevant to its core message, or is it the other way around? Perhaps it was our hitherto approaches to these theories that have led us to dismiss them entirely. All of these questions points back to the main riddle of Evangelion. What is the Human Instrumentality Project? This English term itself is a red herring or a misnomer. The original in Japanese is called Jinrui Hokan Keikaku. The first and last terms are quite self-evident. Jinrui, for example, refers to mankind or humanity, while Keikaku means a plan or project. The problem then arises with the middle term, Hokan, which is usually translated as instrumentality in English. The kanji Hokan is a combination of two characters. On the one hand, the character ho means to supply or compensate. In Chinese, it means to repair something that's broken. On the other hand, kan simply means finish, end, or complete. A combination of the two will thus create hokan, which can be nicely translated as completion, complementation, or perfection. Hence, Jinrui Hokan Keikaku roughly translates to humanity's completion, or complementation, or perfection project. Therefore, what is the inherent failure, lack, and imperfection within humans that Zele desperately wants to overcome? In Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud notes three inevitable sources of human suffering. First, our finite biological body that is fated to decay. Second, the cruel and inhabitable natural world, albeit beautiful. And finally, our relations with others, which, Freud observes, causes us the most pain even if it may seem silly. It is the last source of human suffering that is at stake in Evangelion. In his essay on mass psychology, Freud cites the famous Hedgehog's dilemma from philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's fable tells us that the proximity with the other is almost unbearable for most people, for humans, like hedgehogs, are enveloped with spikes. Humans are thereby prevented from attaining absolute intimacy. We are led to conclude that there is a gap between the self and the other. All we can do is helplessly cling onto one another for the sake of attaining warmth. A warmth that would presumably thaw the frost of loneliness to fill the void in our hearts. The Freudian question, however, is to ask what is it that drives us to desire absolute intimacy in the first place? One of Evangelion's soundtracks is entitled The Pleasure Principle. The pleasure principle, says Freud, is our strong tendency to achieve unity, wholeness, and completeness. Wholeness yields pleasure, and intense feelings of pleasure is called happiness.
Nice.
The pleasure principle is an ironic term, however, because our striving for happiness is at the same time our avoidance of unhappiness and pain. It works like a homeostasis of happiness, unhappiness, back to happiness again, and so forth. A permanent state of happiness is therefore incompatible with human existence. As Freud says, one is inclined to say that the intention of man should be happy has no part in the plan of creation. What we can do, nonetheless, is to modify the pleasure principle into the reality principle. That is, the delay or postponement of our self-gratifications into acceptable forms. Through conforming to societal norms, for example, children learn that they cannot eat their favorite meal every single day, while adults learn not to consume alcohol during work or have sex in public. However, Freud soon realizes that the reality principle is no different than the pleasure principle. Suffering and pain clearly outweighs happiness and pleasure. In consequence, we demand for more intense and lengthier states of pleasures. We want higher and longer feelings of unity and completeness. We only want to repeat things that makes us happy and therefore avoid pain completely. The simplest way to prevent suffering is to run away from the external world and isolate ourselves from others, like a train that departs far away from reality into the world of fantasy. The train, however, is never empty. It carries passengers. Reality is therefore not simply opposed to fantasy in psychoanalytic theory. Rather, we take into the ego as large as possible a part of the outer world, making it the object of unconscious fantasies, a kind of diluting process to mitigate the poignancy of free-floating, unsatisfied, and unsatisfiable unconscious wish impulses. One might give to this process the name of introjection. It was not Freud who wrote these words, but a former colleague and friend of his, Sandor Ferenczi. What are introjected, says Ferenczi, are not objects themselves, but representations of objects. The first object of introjection in one's life is none other than the mother's breast in the oral stage, which Freud refers to the infancy period of weaning. Why the oral stage, you might ask? Because it is our first experience of intimacy. As helpless and vulnerable infants, we are immediately taken care of and loved by our mother. Hence, the breast or mother is our first love object, says Ferenczi. Karl Abraham, another of Freud's colleagues, further argues that the oral stage is followed by the oral sadistic stage, the period of teething. It is only here that the infant learns to bite, to either destroy the object or achieve total mastery of it. Abraham claims that this is the root of our future ambivalence and aggression towards objects. For Melanie Klein, however, ambivalence is already present from the beginning. There is already a splitting of the breast, more specifically, a splitting of the object into good and bad qualities. Only the good part is introjected by the ego, while the bad part is expelled. The nutritional satisfaction of the breast is the good object, while its absence is the bad one. Only the good breast is introjected by the infant, thereby serving as a reference point for future introjections of other objects. Introjection and the oral stage are therefore connected. The logic is quite primitive. If I like the object, I introject it. If I hate it, I'll destroy and devour it. What happens to introjected objects? They come to form our unconscious fantasies. We cling onto these objects therein out of desperateness and stubbornness. These connotations of fantasy and urgency is captured well in Freud's clever usage of the German Besetzung. Fantasy, on the one hand, as Besetzung can mean cast, as in casting a stage or film actor, and on the other hand, urgency, as it can mean occupation, say a military occupation. Both suggest an urgent filling of a role or area. Translators today have rendered Besetzung in English as investment, and sometimes charge as an electrical charge. In Evangelion, however, we find the outdated but popular term Cathexis. In psychoanalysis, Cathexis or Besetzung, therefore, refers to the fact that a certain amount of psychical energy is attached to an idea or to a group of ideas, to a part of the body, to an object, etc. But what is this energy exactly? What are AT fields, or absolute terror fields? Barriers, impenetrable ones, generated by both Evangelion units and angels. AT fields appear as an orange octagon outline upon minimal contact, otherwise they are completely invisible. It was only in episode 26, Nagisa Kaworu's first and last appearance, that we know the truth of AT fields.
そう、君たちリリンはそう呼んでるね。何人にも侵されざる聖なる領域、心の光。リリンも分かってるんだよ。AT フィールドは誰もが持っている心の壁だということ。
The AT field in humans behaves like a thin surface that outlines the ego, like an amoeba that attaches to introjected objects via cathexis. The AT field is therefore what Freud calls the libido. Libido is an expression we refer to the energy of those drives having to do with everything that can be brought together under the heading of love. What we call love is of course what is generally known as love, namely sexual love with the goal of sexual union. However, we do not separate off from it the other things that share the name of love. Self-love on the one hand, and on the other hand, parental and infant love, friendship, general love of humanity, and even dedication to concrete objects as well as to abstract ideas. Our justification is that psychoanalytic investigation has taught us that all these urges are expressions of the same drive impulses as push the sexes in the direction of sexual union. Though in other circumstances they may be pushed away from that sexual goal or state in its achievement, nevertheless, they always preserve enough of their original essence for the identity to remain recognizable. For example, self-sacrifice or striving for greater closeness. It's no wonder that Kaworu's theme song is Ludwig van Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the famous Ode to Joy. Beethoven's piece echoes the universal solidarity of humanity against war and conflict. Hence the lyrical allusions to the Greek Elysium where people rejoice and sing together.
歌はいいね。歌は心を潤してくれる。リリンの生み出した文化の極みだよ。そう感じないか？碇シンジ君。
This, in Freudian terms, is the conspicuous work of the libido. The libido's capacity to unite people into larger units led Freud to call it Eros, the god of love from ancient Greek mythology. Kaworu's serene character, therefore, makes him the embodiment of Eros. In the following scene, Kaworu used the kanji koi, general love, which is easily misheard as koi, sexual love.
常に人間は心に痛みを感じている。心が痛がりだから生きるのも辛いと感じる。ガラスのように繊細だね。特に君の心は。
僕が。
そう、好意に値するよ。
好意。
好きってことさ。
The confusing and ambiguous wordplay is intentional. It depicts what Freud calls sublimation, that is, the libido's deflection of sexual and erotic love to achieve a more universal love like friendship, solidarity, etc. Intimacy is therefore what the libido or Eros seeks. If Kaworu indeed represents Eros, then why is he a proponent of death? In his final words, Kaworu claimed that life and death hold equal value, and to be able to choose death is the one absolute freedom. As Freud writes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the fact that remains is that the organism wants only to die in its own particular way. And so, these guardians of life, too, were originally myrmidons of death. Libido, or Eros, follows the logic of the pleasure principle. It is clear, however, that this homeostatic system easily undermines itself. Victims of war, for instance, or in general, trauma victims, these people are compelled to repeat their horrible experiences in their dreams and symptoms. They would helplessly recall their near-death experiences, witness a fallen comrade, and such. Such fixations on a traumatic encounter is known as the compulsion-to-repeat. The aftermath of World War I proliferated countless of such victims. Like others, Freud was puzzled by this phenomenon. In the compulsion-to-repeat, pleasure is entirely absent. It is just perpetual repetitions of suffering and pain. Why would such a thing, Freud asked, happen at all? However, Freud soon discovers that we have been doing the same all this time. In fact, our life is full of traumatic encounters. That is, full of unfathomable and incomprehensible encounters. One example is the very first time we experience the absence of our caregivers or parents in childhood. At one point in our life, we ask, why is father or mother not at home? Of course, they are away probably for work, rest, or war duty, etc. But the point is that the child does not know this. In the first instance, the child must have felt a degree of uneasiness or possibly frustration. In response, children devise repetitive and aggressive games. Repetitive on the one hand, as we often see children throw and obtain a toy back and forth, or play a game of peekaboo. And aggressive on the other hand, as children would often draw mutilated and severed bodies, or destroy nearby objects. For Freud, such repetitive games enables the child to familiarize a prior unpleasant situation or trauma. Therefore, repetition is what helps the child to become an active participant instead of a passive recipient or victim of unfamiliarity or unpleasure. Trauma is a disruption of the internal from the external. A traumatic encounter is thus beyond one's control and understanding. Trauma is a bombardment. This is what the compulsion-to-repeat seeks to fathom. Furthermore, we can even trace trauma in as early as the oral stage. It was only the mother's choice, for example, not the infant, to withdraw her breast away. The infant is then forced to separate from its only source of comfort, the breast. Hence, the breast is both our first love and lost object. Therein lies the primary cause of the hollow in our hearts. All attempts to rediscover the feeling of completeness in the oral stage afterwards are futile. All pleasures afterwards can never be it. They are, after all, not the original pleasure, but substitutes, replicas. In fact, this repetitive act is exactly what Freud calls the drive, or Trieb in German. A drive, says Freud, might accordingly be seen as a powerful tendency inherent in every living organism to restore a prior state, that the organism was compelled to relinquish due to disruptive influence of external forces. Perhaps our drives to achieve intimacy, wholeness, and completeness is in fact a re-achieving of it. In other words, the drives of life, libido or eros, must be an aspiration to a much older and primordial state. If the oral stage was the original intimacy and wholeness, what does that say about life itself? What caused the pleasure principle to start its homeostasis? Life, as it were, sways back and forth between happiness and unhappiness. But what caused it to swing in the first place? What was prior to this equilibrium? What was the original states of everything? If so, then isn't living itself just one big trauma? Perhaps the libido's power to unify people in the form of Eros is a facsimile of a much primordial unity. If this is the case, Freud writes, then we can only say that the goal of life is death, or to express it retrospectively, the inanimate existed before the animate. Therefore, what undermines the activities of Eros or libido is a more radical drive, a drive that does not remain, but as Freud's essay title indicates, goes beyond the pleasure principle to achieve a more primordial unity. This is what Freud daringly calls the death drive. The death drive, as Freud writes, is charged with the task of causing animate organisms to revert to an inanimate state, whereas Eros pursues the goal of maximizing the complexity of life, and thereby of course preserving it, by an ever more catholic combination of the particles into which living matter had been fragmented. The death drive is a very paradoxical concept. Though it appears destructive, as it seeks to disintegrate the unity of the libido or AT fields into nothing and thereby death, it is in fact trying to achieve an original and hence primordial state of completeness that Eros tries to imitate. That is, the primordial inertia and peace prior to life. Just like Evangelion's recurring imagery of a water droplet merging back to the still and undisturbed surface. The death drive, as Gendo and Zele says, is simply a return to the origin of everything.
違う。虚無へ帰るわけではない。すべてを始まりへ戻すに過ぎない。この世界に失われている母へと帰るだけだ。すべての心が一つとなり、永遠の安らぎを得る。ただそれだけのことに過ぎない。
The goal of the death drive is therefore a myth, not because it is false, but because it is presupposed as if it is real. No one thinks that the death drive is real, not even Freud himself. and yet everyone unconsciously behaves as if it is. After all, is the death drive not accomplishing what the libido wants all along? Why are we so obsessed then with desiring intimacy, closeness, and peace? Why bother make love with the other, misunderstand or hate the other, and risk getting hurt when you can literally become one and the same being? Is this not what all of our desires have implied all along?
だからって人の心を一つにまとめお互いに補填し合おうというわけ？それも他人が勝手に余計なお世話だわ。そんなのただの馴れ合いじゃない。だけどあなたもそれを望んでいたの。
Evangelion fulfills our unconscious desire with the Human Instrumentality Project, the unification of all souls into one consummate being. In the end of Evangelion, the death drive no longer becomes a myth, but a cosmological and theological reality. It actualizes what ancient theologians and philosophers call all, or the one, the absolute first principle of all existence. All life, according to this doctrine, are merely imperfect fragments of it. In Christian terms, human instrumentality is the return to the paradise of immortality prior to humanity's fall into sin. Or in Kabbalistic terms, to unite all impartial souls in the tree of life and return to the chamber of Komm. Komm is the Hebrew word for body, namely, to restore our imperfect mortal bodies into the immortal bodies of Adam and Lilith, the primordial humans, and their forbidden unity is no different than the state of being God himself. And finally, in psychoanalytic terms, to finally rediscover the primordial lost object, the mother's breast and comfort, and therefore become a subject without a lack. Hence, it's incorrect to say that the death drive or human instrumentality is suicide. As Gendo and Zele claimed, it is simply a return to the beginning. If death is prior to life, then death is in retrospect more lifelike than life. Death, viewed in this way, is as attractive as sweetness. In fact, the death drive, summed up in one phrase, is precisely Komm, Süsser Tod, come sweet death. As the lyric says it clearly,
It all returns to nothing. It all comes tumbling down, tumbling down, tumbling down. It all...
Intriguingly, Freud wrote that we are driven to the supposition that the death drives very largely remain silent, and that the clamor of life comes mostly from Eros. The death drive's silence is a silence or muting of life's inherent emptiness, frustration, rage, and guilt that Eros tries to mitigate and cover up. And thus, when the death drive is finally heard, it is no surprise that it only speaks the language of hate and aggression. If Eros is Kaworu, then the death drive must be the quiet Ayanami. If Eros is the mythological name for the libido's unifying power, then the name of its disintegration is Thanatos, the Greek god of death. It is worth pointing out that the titles of both Rei's soundtrack and the credit song of The End of Evangelion alludes to Thanatos. And if the AT field is the energy of the libido, then the anti-AT field, which destroys and reverts all life back to the primordial form, LCL, is known as destrudo, a term coined by psychoanalyst Eduardo Weiss. Throughout Evangelion, for instance, the nerve organization ensures that the Eva pilot's mental state shows no manifestations of destrudo. In fact, the opposition between libido and destrudo is made clear in a graph from episode 20.
解パルス接続完了。了解。
However, Freud himself never once used the terms Thanatos and destrudo in any of his published writings. The outcome of human instrumentality is not the primordial peace that Gendo and Zele had hoped for. On the contrary, it became the very thing that had guaranteed would not happen: nothingness. Or rather, the unity or perfection of all beings into the Primordial One is, in fact, nothing. For philosopher Hegel, this paradox comes to no surprise, because the origin, the pure, and the primordial, says Hegel, is just the same as nothing. It is impossible for any substance to be undifferentiated or completely equal to itself. Otherwise, it is devoid of content and is therefore empty. For something to exist at all, it has to minimally be unequal to itself, must fail to be itself. Hegel calls this process self-othering. The truth is neither being nor nothing, but rather that being has passed over into nothing and nothing into being. Has passed over, says Hegel, not passes over. Hegel's emphasis on using the past tense indicates that the primordial one was always already in relation with nothing. This relation, however, is paradoxically a non-relation, a disunity, a split. This is one of the fundamental premises of Hegel's dialectics. Is Hegel's dialectics not, in this precise sense, the thought of the split of the one into two? The Hegelian twosome designates a split which cleaves the one from within, not into two parts. The ultimate split is not between two halves, but between something and nothing, between the one and the void of its place. In this split, the opposition between the one and its outside is reflected back into the very identity of the one. Therefore, the idea that there was a pre-established harmony of everything is nothing but a retroactive illusion. Put differently, there never was a primordial one. For the one to be a one, it must already be split into two, not into two equal parts, but an inherent or constitutive split from itself. It was ironically Sen Kyokuko, a devoted critic of Hegel, who articulated the dialectic brilliantly in the language of theology.
だが現在の汚れなき浄化された世界だ。
俺は罪にまみれても人が生きている世界を望むよ。
The term sin literally means missing the mark, and thus fail with consequences. However, it is only missing the mark which creates the mark itself. The original sin, the moment Adam and Eve consumed the fruit, is nothing but a realization of what they always already were. Mortal and naked beings. They have always been this way. They were just unaware of it prior to the fall. Hence, the fall is what drives them out of their limbo. In other words, we never were immortal and innocent. We never had it in the first place. This is why for Kierkegaard, the nostalgic return to immortality is a total nightmare. Despair, absolute hopelessness, is not our mortality and finitude, not the fact that we will bite the dust one day. True despair, on the contrary, is precisely when we finally obtain immortality and infinitude. As Kierkegaard puts it, when the danger is so great that death becomes the hope, then despair is the hopelessness of not even being able to die. It is in this last sense that despair is the sickness unto death, this tormenting contradiction, this sickness of the self, perpetually to be dying, to die and yet not die, to die death. In immortality, you're compelled to repeat life ad infinitum. Life becomes an unbearable excess. It becomes a disease that makes you very sick and deprives your inability to live fully, and yet denies you from choosing death as the only recourse. Here, you are neither the living nor the dead, but the undead. This is what Kierkegaard paradoxically calls the sickness unto death. Is this not what Shinji experienced in episode 16? Hence the Japanese title for that episode. Maybe Kaworu was right after all to claim that being able to die is the highest freedom. Because to have a self, to be a self, writes Kierkegaard, is the greatest concession, an infinite concession given to man. But it is also eternity's claim upon him. In this sense, there is an immanent immortality within our very own mortal self. Therefore, what is the self?
シンジ君の肉体は自我境界線を失って量子状態のままエントリープラグ内を漂っていると推測されます。
What Freud calls the ego in psychoanalysis is not the self, but the sense of self or self-image.
シンジ君を構成していた物質は全てプラグ内に保存されているし、魂というべきものもそこに存在している。現に彼の自我イメージがプラグスーツを疑似的に実体化させているわ。
The ego is simply one's individual psychology, personhood, or personality. However, there is no entity present in the individual from the very beginning that is equatable with the ego. The ego has to be developed, Freud notes. Despite the ego's sense of mastery and independence, it is not self-evident how it came to be. In other words, how does one come to be aware of one's own self-image? After all, we can only see our limbs and torso, but neither our face nor back. Unless one perceives an image of themselves reflected on a mirror-like surface, either a physical mirror or someone other than oneself, another ego, another me, an other. The ego can recognize itself only if there is an other to recognize him or her first. For the first person to be possible at all, we need to first view ourselves from a second-person point of view. Freud calls this process identification, which is the earliest expression of an emotional attachment to the other. The individual psychology is thus dependent on the other's psychology. An individual's own ego is not even his or hers to begin with. It is rather the other who first constructs the individual's own self-image. Mother is the first other, as one of Evangelion's soundtracks says.
一番最初の他人は母親。母親はあなたとは違う人間なのよ。
In this sense, the ego is itself an other. That is why humans need each other. That is why I need you. The antithesis between individual psychology and social or mass psychology, which at first glance may seem to us important, loses a great deal of its sharpness on close examination. Freud began his mass psychology essay with this very sentence, but he was not the first to have had this insight. It was once again Hegel who long ago already theorized the individual's dependency on others. Thanks to Alexandre Kojève, we are familiar with what is known today as the most famous passage from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the chapter wherein Hegel tells the myth of self-consciousness' first encounter with the other. To cut the long story short, human subjectivity is constituted by the other. This Kojève calls the dialectic of recognition. That is to say, the individual's desire is intertwined with the other's desire, and he or she desires the other as they are the only source of achieving self-recognition. This mutual dependency is known as intersubjectivity. For Kojève, humans differ from animals in their self-consciousness. The reason they can build social relations is because they have intersubjective desire. Animal needs can be satisfied without the other, but for human desires, the other is essentially necessary. However, for the dialectic of recognition to be a proper Hegelian dialectic, we must note two crucial points. First is that self-recognition is never symmetrical. Prior to its encounter with the other, there was, theoretically, no ego. Hence, what precedes the ego is the ego that exists in the minds of others, or what Freud calls the ideal ego. The problem is that the ego recognizes itself as the ideal ego, albeit that it was never and thereby can never be that ideal mirage. Jacques Lacan was thus right to say that the ego is not founded on a self or me recognition, but a misrecognition. What Kojève's reading of Hegel misses, unfortunately, is the radical inhuman and unconscious dimension of self-consciousness itself. In fact, Hegel makes it clear that for self-consciousness, there is another self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is outside of itself. Es ist außer sich gekommen. In German, außer sich literally means outside of itself. Metaphorically, it can also mean to not be oneself, say when one suddenly bursts in rage, laughter, sadness, etc. Hegel's wordplay therefore implies that self-consciousness is immanently unconscious. Secondly, one must be very careful with how Hegel uses the term other. When self-consciousness first encounters the other, for instance, that other is always someone whom we cannot fully fathom or identify with. Identification allows us to believe that we know the other inside out, but all it does is deprive the other from its otherness. The fact is, identification is ambivalent from the outset. It can as easily turn into an expression of tenderness as into a wish to remove, Freud says. The other, the human other, is therefore not even a proper other at all, but distorted self-images or projections of the ego. We can recognize the other, acknowledge him as person, only insofar as in a radical sense he remains unknown to us. Recognition implies the absence of cognition. Intersubjectivity is founded upon the fact that the other is phenomenologically experienced as an unknown quantity, as a bottomless abyss which we can never fathom. It is precisely this unfathomable abyss which makes proximity with the other so unbearable. Thus, for Freud and Lacan, the biblical injunction, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," is impossible to follow. Namely, it is disastrous and impossible to love a neighbor, let alone oneself. Freud's theory of identification reveals that people only love the other insofar as the other resemble much of themselves, insofar as the other is recognizable, relatable, and predictable. A neighbor, in contrast, is a true other. To use Lacan's terms, a neighbor is not a little other with a small o, but an absolute other with a capital O. So why must the O be capitalized? For a no doubt mad reason, says Lacan. Precisely because the absolute other is unfathomable. Unlike the little other, who is my human counterpart, the absolute other is someone of a radical otherness, alterity, and foreignness. The absolute other is impersonal and inhuman. Otherness represents the fundamental category of immunology. The absolute other stings, hurts, and decenters the self from its mastery. That is why for Lacan, the other evokes the enigmatic question, "Que voi?" What do you want from me? The little other and the absolute other, however, are not two separate entities. Lacan's point is rather that the other is there qua absolute other. This is what Hegel means by the term other. The other is therefore inherently ambiguous. It always escapes identification by the ego. Behind every recognizable lover, friend, or family lies a monstrous neighbor whom we cannot love, relate to, and understand. When the other tells me not to cross the line between the two of us, do they really mean it? Our frustration with the other, however, is unjustified and hypocritical. Well, because our inability to recognize and understand other people is also due to the inability of even recognizing and understanding our own self.
100% 理解し合うのは不可能なんだよ。まあ、だからこそ人は自分を他人を知ろうと努力する。だから面白いんだな、人生は。
美里さんともですか？
彼女というのは遥か彼方の女と書く。女性は向こう岸の存在だよ。我々にとってはね。男と女の間には海よりも広くて深い川があるってことさ。
僕には大人の人はわかりません。
Psychoanalysis thus reveals that the self is split between the self that is actually seen and the self observing that. The self that is seen is, of course, the ego, our psychology, stable personality, or self-identity. The ego is itself an other, yes, but a little other. We can still recognize our own ego. Hence, Lacan calls the ego an object. Specifically, the ego is the object of experiences. As Rei number 2 makes it clear in episode 25, I became myself over the time that I've existed and through the connections that I've formed with others. Interactions with others and the passage of time will change the shape of my heart. Yes, those are what created the person that I have been, the object called Rei Ayanami. They will create the person I will be. But there's another real you, says Rei number 1. You just don't know it. You don't want to see her, so you just keep avoiding her subconsciously, because she might not be human in shape. Because the person you have been up until now might disappear. You're afraid that who you are will vanish. You're afraid that you'll disappear from everyone's hearts. There is, thus, a non-psychological, unfathomable, and impersonal self, whereas the ego views itself as if it were another person, from a second-person point of view, from a little other. This self, however, observes the ego from an unknowable sight, from a third-person point of view, from the standpoint of the absolute other. This real and inhuman self is what Freud famously calls the It, or das in German. This is the controversial unconscious self. The It is what Lacan also calls the subject, as opposed to the ego, which is an object. The It, Freud tells us, is a primordial reservoir of libido. The It is literally a power plant. Freud's description, however, is misleading. Didn't Freud himself earlier said that libido remains within the pleasure principle? Libido thus cannot be primordial. What is primordial instead is the wholeness that the libido tries to imitate and achieve under Eros. The It, therefore, is not the reservoir of libido, but the reservoir of what Lacan calls jouissance. What am I? Asks Lacan, to which he answers, I am in the place from which the universe is a flaw in the purity of non-being is vociferated. This place is called Jouissance, and it is Jouissance whose absence would render the universe vain. Jouissance is the primordial wholeness that the death drive seeks to return to, the Garden of Eden prior to the fall, the mother-infant unity in the oral stage prior to their separation. Jouissance is therefore the psychoanalytic term for the Primordial One. If the libido is the AT fields, then jouissance must be the primordial soup of LCL. The relationship between the two finds its clearest expression in Lacan's myth of the lamella. The lamella is an amoeba-like creature so thin that it can slip beneath doors. Attacking it is almost impossible. Touching it might make it slip between your fingers, while cutting it would just make it reproduce itself in your very skin. This image, writes Lacan, shows libido to be what it is, namely, an organ to which its habits make it far more akin than to a force field. Let us say that it is qua surface that it organizes this force field. Once again, this makes it very clear that the AT fields represents the libido. It literally outlines and shapes our self. The libido, or lamella, engulfs our real self, kills it, and possesses it. The personal I is lived by the impersonal it.
真実を見せてあげるわ。
In German, the word S has a unique use. Unlike the English it, the German S can denote an unnerving sense of a particular and yet unidentifiable, unbiddable presence or force that can assert itself both within us and in the world around us.
人の真似をしている偽りの物体に過ぎないのよ。ほら、あなたの中に暗くて何も見えない、何もわからない心があるでしょ。本当のあなたがそこにいるの。
The real you is the it. However, the term real must be understood in the strict Lacanian sense. The real is not a positive entity and has neither depth nor substantiality. The real is precisely the realm of the Primordial One, or Jouissance, the realm of the pristine, pure, undifferentiated and untainted by external forces. The real is therefore nothing, or rather, the real is nothing but a retroactive construction. The idea that there was such a thing as the real exists only after it has been differentiated from itself. In other words, the myth of the lamella can be viewed as the myth for humanity's immersion into language. Language has always been here before our birth and will remain so even after our death. Our parents speak and dream of us, for instance, and assign our names before our very existence.
男だったらシンジ、女だったらレイと名付ける。
In more precise terms, the real is always already mediated by the symbolic, the realm of signifiers. Signifier is a term Lacan greatly owes to Ferdinand de Saussure. A signifier can be a word, gesture, a symbol, an object, facial expression, and the list goes on. A signifier stands for a signified, its meaning. The signifier apple, for instance, stands for the concept of an apple, the signified. Lacan, however, uses the term signifier in a very precise way. Signifier is a feature, a mark which represents the subject. I am what I am through signifiers that represent me. Signifiers constitute my symbolic identity. Thus, for Lacan, there are so-called privileged signifiers, signifiers that are unquestioned and taken for granted. This Lacan calls the phallus, written as the symbol phi. The phallus is the signifier of omnipotent power. The phallus works both metaphorically and literally like a penis. It is forever external and sticks out from our body. In Evangelion, the phallus is no doubt the entry plug. The entry plug is an external cockpit that needs to be inserted into the Evangelion units. Only then can the Eva pilots synchronize their minds and bodies together with the Evangelion. However, Shinji and Asuka do not pilot the Eva for its power, but rather to obtain recognition and praises from others. Hence, the phallus is also called the signifier of desire. If I pilot the Eva, for example, then mom or dad will love me. Even if it brings me immense suffering, I helplessly cling onto it, for the phallus promises me a stable self-identity or total personality. Therein lies the paradox of the phallus. The more you hold on to it, the more you are castrated. The price for omnipotence is to render yourself impotent. You become nothing without the phallus. You learn to sustain your symbolic identity through the phallus. Therefore, the phallus is also paradoxically the signifier of castration.
エヴァそのものが君の全てになってしまう。
本当のあなた自身はどこにもいなくなってしまうの。
いいんだ。もともと僕には何にもなかったんだ。習っていたチェロだって何にもならなかったんだ。
自分から何もしなかっただけじゃないの。
でも今はエヴァに乗れるんだ。
で、そのうちエヴァがなければ何もできなくなるのよ。私みたいに。
それが僕の全てだから。
However, Lacan also calls the phallus the unary signifier, or S1 for short. That is to say, it is what abstracts and reduces the real, the primordial one, jouissance, immediacy, pristine reality, or the all of continuity, into a single, lifeless, cold, and dull signifier. Hence, the phallus, or unary signifier, can also be called the signifier of jouissance. The unary signifier is precisely the Freudian It, our real self, the reservoir or power plant of primordial jouissance. But there never was a jouissance. Only after it has been marked by the unary signifier can jouissance exist as a retroactive construction. What was prior to nothing? What is pure nothingness? As Hegel's dialectics has showed, there was never such a thing as pure nothingness. All we have is a nothing that is always already differentiated by being. Nothing always already is. For this reason, the phallus is effectively the signifier of the void, or the signifier of lack. Nothing itself becomes a signifier. The signifier, in short, introduces nothing into the natural movement, says Lacan. The truth of the phallus is that it is an empty signifier. It is no wonder that Lacan's symbol for a phallus is synonymous with the symbol of an empty set. The phallus is like a box that contains the coveted treasure, only to reveal itself that the treasure is nothing. Not because the treasure is stolen, but because the treasure is literally nothing, a void. In Freudian terms, this empty treasure box is the It. In fact, Lacan even illustrates the Freudian It as the terrifying lion's mouth in Venice, Italy. A kind of intimidating large container filled with anonymous handwritten wishes and prayers. A reservoir, yes, as it were, writes Lacan. That is what the It is, and even a reserve. But what is produced in it, missives of prayer or denunciation, comes from the outside, and if it accumulates inside, it is in order to sleep there. The It is not substantial. Rather, the It is a purely formal structure. This explains why the It is the real or absolute other within us. Not because the It is a mysterious entity that lurks deep within us, but because it is literally nothing, an abysmal void. What ultimately gives the It its content and thus conceals the void comes from the outside, from the otherness of language. This symbolic aspect of the other is what Lacan calls the big other. The big other watches us in our dreams and fantasies. The big other is a virtual figure who guarantees, listens, and witnesses our personal truth. It is no wonder that the big other can be equated with God, society, a cause, father, or mother. The big other is what enables us to view ourselves from a third-person point of view. Therein lies Freud's notorious concept of the unconscious. The Freudian unconscious is not the substantial iceberg hidden beneath the surface. On the contrary, the unconscious lies outside. It is self-consciousness itself. It is out there when we unconsciously utter words that we do not intend to speak and desire objects that we do not genuinely want. Thus, what seems to be one's most personal desires and fantasies are probably not theirs to begin with, for they have always already been entangled with the other. Hence, Lacan writes that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. The unconscious is full of other people's talk, other people's conversations, and other people's goals, aspirations, and fantasies, insofar as they are expressed in words. In Evangelion, for example, we see the recurring phrase of I am I or I am me. Of course, the proposition I am I is self-referential, a tautology and thus devoid of content. This insubstantial single signifier, without reference to anything other than itself, is the Freudian It. However, the statement I am I is already in itself a contradiction, because I am I always already presupposes that I am not I. I am not tables, clothes, my name, etc. At the same time, I am all of them. The unconscious It, lodged within a subject that it vastly exceeds, is the reservoir of possibility, of all that might be but is not. The It in the I transforms subjecthood from psychic density into pure potentiality. In Saussurean linguistics, this is called differentiality. Namely, a signifier has no positive or intrinsic content, but only negative differences to other signifiers and to itself. A signifier is only what it is not. This is also what Hegel long ago called determinate negation. That is to say, a thing is never just a thing. It can only be itself in the absence of what it is not. Is not Hegel's basic insight precisely that every external opposition is grounded in the thing's immanent self-opposition, that every external difference implies self-difference? A finite being differs from other finite things because it is already not identical with itself. Therefore, what constitutes the identity of the Shinji who pilots the Eva lies the absence of a Shinji who does not pilot the Eva.
そうだ、これも一つの世界。僕の中の可能性。今の僕が僕そのものではない。いろんな僕自身があり得るんだ。そうだ、エヴァのパイロットではない僕もあり得るんだ。
It is none other than the process of introjection which allows this to occur at all. Introjection makes the subject into a linguistic signifier in a system, which thereby permits him to relate symbolically to other signifiers. That is, at once to relate to other humans and to articulate his own desire, his own unconscious unawares. It is not object representations that are introjected, but precisely signifiers. Hence, signifiers are what forms the unconscious. Introjection is thus always a linguistic introjection, as it allows the subject to relate itself to otherness. To convert Ferenczi's words into Lacanian terms, introjection is a kind of diluting process of the real and thus mitigates the poignancy of free-floating jouissance into the symbolic. Although introjection appears to diminish pristine reality, it is paradoxically what allows a breathing space for the subject to exist in the first place. In Kierkegaardian and Hegelian terms, the introjection of the unary signifier is the very negativity or restriction that prevents the self from the anxiety of the one or jouissance, from vanishing into pure nothingness due to the dizziness of freedom. Hence, Lacan also calls the unary signifier, or the phallus, as the name of the father, which is a wordplay in French, as it can also mean the no of the father. The no is precisely the prohibition of jouissance which never existed, and is therefore, paradoxically, always already impossible in itself. Though the real is always already mediated by the symbolic, an excess of the real nonetheless lingers as a ghastly residue. This phantom remainder of jouissance punctures a black hole in our hearts. Desire condenses around it while the drive seeks to eliminate it. Hence, Lacan says that jouissance does not exist, but it insists. It insists the subject that it has lost something real, that it has lost a primordial object that was once a part of itself. That is, the mother's breast and warmth in the oral stage. However, it was never ours to begin with. The breast was never lost, let alone owned by us. How could the breast be perceived as an object if there was no subject to experience it first? In jouissance, the infant is one and the same with its surroundings. It literally molds itself as the breast, like LCL. In analogous with the biblical fall, it was only the infant's separation from its mother that the breast can be perceived retroactively as a lost object. The infant split from its mother, like our fall from paradise, is a loss of jouissance, but since jouissance is effectively nothing, it is thus retroactively a loss of nothing. The loss of nothing does not result in nothing again, however, but an excess of nothing. Since the excess comes from nothing, it is therefore a less than nothing. A paradoxical excess that is excess to nothing, belongs to nothing, and attaches itself to nothing. A plus de jouir, surplus jouissance. Lacan's name for this surplus is the objet petit a, or simply objet a. The objet a is the very emanation of human misery, unhappiness, and loneliness. It is precisely the black hole in our hearts. The objet a is a remainder, or perhaps a reminder, to use Lacan's wordplay, that we have lost a primordial object, innocence and peace, all of which never existed. We thereby live the rest of our lives trying to rediscover this lost object. We desperately desire all sorts of objects to feel complete again, but they are never quite it. The objet a fool us like magic. It takes shape as that alluring property or feature. It makes someone special in your very eyes, those lips, eyes, breast, neck, voice, beard, personality, etc. The objet a is what transforms dull objects into desirable ones. Before you realize it, you have fallen in love with it. There is a reason why we fall in love. We unconsciously fall in love, not consciously walk towards it. The cause of the fall is precisely objet a. Hence it is also called the object cause of desire. For Lacan, desire as such is fundamentally elusive. It is never the desire for objects, but the desire for desire itself, the desire to sustain desire. Desire is always the unconscious desire for the objet a. In other words, we never really know what we truly want. All too often, people run away from what they truly desire. When people finally obtain the objects of their desire, for instance, they immediately desire for something else. Or when alas people are together with who they love, desire ceases immediately, for the person is no longer captivating. In The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan writes, the only thing of which one can be guilty is of having given ground relative to one's desire. You tell me that you love me, but why? What do you desire in me? Is it to resolve your insecurity? What do you seek in me? Is it just to resolve your loneliness? If so, then this is not true love, is it? Because anyone will do. Psychoanalysis tells us to radically take responsibility for what we unconsciously desire and love, our eros or libido. Do you love me, or do you love the objet a within me? As Lacan puts it, I love you, but because inexplicably, I love you in you something more than you, the objet a, I mutilate you. Do you love me just to find explanations to your trauma? To find answers to why your father, who was never there for you, and your mother was the one who sacrificed his life protecting you? To find answers to why your mother chose to kill herself rather than accept the truth that the man she loved never really loved her. Therein lies the fates of both Misato Katsuragi and Dr. Ritsuko Akagi. They have unconsciously followed their parents' discourse. This is no doubt the compulsion to repeat, a repetition to make sense of a prior trauma. The objet A is therefore closely related to the death drive, which explains Rei's fleeting appearance before their very death.